Carroll Quigley, Tragedy and Hope, The Home Front, 1914 to 1980. The First World War was a catastrophe of such magnitude that, even today, the imagination has some difficulty grasping it. In the year 1916, in two battles, Verdun and the Somme, casualties of over 1,700,000 were suffered by both sides. In the artillery barrage which opened the French attack on Chemin-des-Dames in April 1917, 11 million shells were fired on a 30-mile front in 10 days. 3 months later, on an 11-mile front at Passchendaele, the British fired 4,250,000 shells costing £22 million in a preliminary barrage and lost 400,000 men in the ensuing infantry assault. In the German attack of March 1918, 62 divisions with 4,500 heavy guns and 1,000 planes were held on a front only 45 miles wide. On all fronts in the whole war, almost 13 million men in the various armed forces died from wounds and disease. It has been estimated by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace that a war destroyed over $400 billion of property at a time when the value of every object in France and Belgium was not worth over 75 billion. Obviously, expenditures of men and wealth at traits like these required a tremendous mobilization of resources throughout the world, and could not fail to have far-reaching effects on the patterns of thought and modes of action of people forced to undergo such a strain. Some states were destroyed or permanently crippled. There were profound modifications in finance, in economic life, in social relations, in intellectual outlook, and in emotional patterns. Nevertheless, two facts should be recognized. The war brought nothing really new into the world. Rather, it sped up processes of change which had been going on for a considerable period and would have continued anyway, with the result that changes which would have taken place over a period of 30 or even 50 years in peacetime were brought about in 5 years during the war. Also, the changes were much greater in objective facts and in the organization of society than there were in men's ideas of these facts or organization. It was if the changes were too rapid for men's minds to accept them, or what is more likely, that men, seeing the great changes which were occurring on all sides, recognized them but assumed that they were merely temporary, wartime aberrations, and that when peace came they would pass away and everyone could go back to the slow, pleasant world of 1913. This point of view, which dominated the thinking of the 1920s, was widespread and very dangerous. In their efforts to go back to 1913, men refused to recognize that the wartime changes were more or less permanent, and instead of trying to solve the problems arising from these changes, set up a false facade of pretense, painted to look like 1913, to cover up the great changes which had taken place. Then, by acting as if this facade were a reality, and by neglecting the maladjusted reality which was moving beneath it, the people of the 1920s drifted in a hectic world of unreality until the world depression of 1929 to 1935 and the international crisis which followed tore away the facade and showed the horrible, long neglected reality beneath it. The magnitude of the war and the fact that it might last for more than 6 months were quite unexpected for both sides and were impressed upon them only gradually. It first became clear in regard to consumption of supplies, especially ammunition, and in the problem of how to pay for these supplies. In July 1914, the military men were confident that a decision would be reached in 6 months because their military plans and the examples of 1866 and 1870 indicated an immediate decision. This belief was supported by the financial experts who, while greatly underestimating the cost of fighting, were confident that the financial resources of all states would be exhausted in 6 months. By financial resources they meant the gold reserves of the various nations. These were clearly limited. All the great powers were on the gold standard under which banknotes and paper money could be converted into gold on demand. However, each country suspended the gold standard at the outbreak of war. This removed the automatic limitation on the supply of paper money. Then each country proceeded to pay for the war by borrowing from the banks. The banks created the money which they lent by merely giving the government a deposit of any size against which the government could draw checks. The banks were no longer limited in the amount of credit they could create because they no longer had to pay out gold for checks on demand. Thus the creation of money in the form of credit by the banks was limited only by the demands of its borrowers. Naturally, as governments borrowed to pay for their needs, private businesses borrowed in order to be able to fill the government's orders. The gold, which could no longer be demanded, merely rested in the vaults, except where some of it was exported to pay for supplies from neutral countries or from fellow belligerents. As a result, the percentage of outstanding banknotes covered by gold reserves steadily fell, and the percentage of bank credit covered by either gold or banknotes fell even further. Naturally, when the supply of money was increased in this fashion faster than the supply of goods, prices rose, because a larger supply of money was competing for a smaller supply of goods. This effect was made worse by the fact that the supply of goods tended to be reduced by wartime destruction. People received money for making capital goods, consumers' goods, and munitions, but they could spend their money only to buy consumers' goods, since capital goods and munitions were not offered for sale. Since governments tried to reduce the supply of consumers' goods while increasing the supply of the other two products, the problem of rising prices, inflation, became acute. At the same time, the problem of public debt became steadily worse, because governments were financing such a large part of their activities by bank credit. These two problems, inflation and public debt, continued to grow even after the fighting stopped, because of the continued disruption of economic life and the need to pay for past activities. Only in the period 1920 to 1925 did these two stop increasing in most countries, and they remained problems long after the war. Inflation indicates not only an increase in the prices of goods, but also a decrease in the value of money, since it will buy less goods. Accordingly, people in an inflation seek to get goods and get rid of money. Thus inflation increases production and purchases for consumption or hoarding, but it reduces saving or creation of capital. It benefits debtors by making a fixed money debt less of a burden, but injures creditors by reducing the value of their savings and credits. Since the middle classes of European society with their bank savings, checking deposits, mortgages, insurance, and bond holdings, were the creditor class. They were injured and even ruined by the wartime inflation. In Germany, Poland, Hungary, and Russia, where the inflation went so far that the monetary unit became completely valueless by 1924, the middle classes were largely destroyed, and their members were driven to desperation, or at least to an almost psychopathic hatred of the former government or the social class that they believed to be responsible for their plight.